So I'm very much interested in language. I do research on language learning, but I also do research on bilingualism, and that's the area that I would like to talk about today. Right, so bilingualism or multilingualism is very common. More than 50% of the world's population speaks more than one language. But is the knowledge of an additional language advantageous, or is it not? Historically, people rather thought that it might not be a good idea to grow up with more than one language. So during a large part of the 20th century, growing up bilingual was thought to be bad for children. It was argued that this has detrimental effects on children's social and personal development. But this idea was then replaced in the second half of the 20th century with a finding that growing up bilingual and being bilingual is rather beneficial. However, that doesn't mean that bilingualism doesn't have any disadvantages. I hear some funny noises in the background. Right. So one of these disadvantages is slower and more effortful access to words in our minds, also called lexical access. So one task that has been used to show this is the so-called verbal fluency task. In this task, participants are asked, for instance, to name as many animals in 60 seconds as they can. Bilinguals typically name fewer animals in this task. That is, they have a harder time to come up with words, and that's not explained by a smaller vocabulary that they might have. Bilingual speakers also experience more often what is called a tip of the tongue state. So that's the phenomenon that one cannot quite come up with a word that one wants to say. So you know what you want to say, but you can't just come up with the word that you need. You might even know what the beginning sound of the word is or how many syllables it has, but you just cannot come up with the actual word. Disadvantages have also been found for the development of language in children. Even though children growing up with more than one language hit developmental milestones like babbling or the first word at the same time as monolingual children, they develop their languages more slowly. So they acquire vocabularies in the two languages more slowly, while their total vocabulary typically surpasses that of monolingual children. In the study that I was involved in with colleagues at the University of Plymouth and Kent, we found that the vocabulary of young children is in the range of that of monolingual children if their language input, well, the input in a particular language is at least 60%. Apart from vocabulary, bilingual children also show slower grammar development. For instance, they are slower in correctly forming the past tense of irregular verbs, like he went to school. What they usually say is he go to school. This is very typical for children. That's how they start. But bilingual children tend to do this for longer than monolingual children. So the reason for this slow development is simply due to the reduced opportunities for bilingual children to hear and speak their two languages. So the time they learn each language is naturally reduced compared to monolingual children. Importantly, though, bilingual children catch up with their monolingual peers, usually in the first years of school. As we've seen, being bilingual has disadvantages in language abilities, but in contrast, there are also various advantages. And the advantage that might come to mind first are social and economic advantages. So speaking another language means that one can travel and learn more easily about other cultures and countries. One can read foreign newspapers or novels and poems in the original language. One can even go to and work in a different country like me. And as for a society, language knowledge leads to greater intercultural understanding and interactions, and that has benefits for social well-being, for political and economic relationships, as well as for economic prosperity of a country. So this is all the good sides that people usually associate with language learning. However, there's various other advantages. Being bilingual also has benefits for cognition, particularly in terms of cognitive control, thus the control of thoughts and emotions, or the control of actions. This has, for instance, been shown with the following task. So this is a task that requires switching between rules. So in this task, participants are asked to determine whether figures on a computer screen, these appear one at a time, whether they're either a triangle or a circle, or whether the figure is red or blue. So these are the two rules that they have to switch between. So what they have to decide on in a particular case, or in a particular symbol or figure that they see, is shown by a cue that appears just before the figure. That's just like here shown. The participants might first see a rainbow color cue, and that tells them to respond to the color of the next figure. So they do this by pressing a button. And then they might see a shape cue, and that tells them to respond to the shape of the next figure. And just like here, where they have to say that's the circle. So in some trials, they have to switch the rules. In other trials, they don't have to switch the rule. They stick with the rule that they just responded to. And what has been found is that bilinguals show a smaller switch cost. Thus, they're faster and more accurate when they have to switch between rules. Another advantage is in memory. So particular older bilingual adults have been shown to be better at remembering words and faces. So this is shown in a task where they are presented with a long list of words or a long list of faces. And then they have to decide for particular words afterwards or particular faces, whether they had seen them in this list before or not. And these older bilingual adults are better than older monolingual adults. The effect in younger groups is rather minimal. Furthermore, while I had shown that there are some disadvantages in terms of language skills, there are also a number of advantages in terms of language skills. So for instance, bilinguals or bilingual children have better metalinguistic awareness. So that means that they are better at noting and correcting grammatical errors in sentences. So it's thought that they reflect more on language in general than monolingual children. They're also better at learning names for objects or actions that they already have a name for. For instance, tennis shoes, when they already know the word for trainers. So this can be explained by the fact that children learn two words. Bilingual children learn two words for the same objects in their two languages. Advantages also reach into the area of social skills. So this is an example Let me just add these ones. This is an example from a study by one of my PhD students, Valeria Agostini. So she tested what the exposure to a second language in reception classes does to children's perspective-taking skills. So perspective taking refers to the awareness that other people have different knowledge, ideas, intentions, and emotions than oneself. So this is something that children need to learn. They're not born with that. So in this task here, a child plays a game with an adult. The two people, so the child and the adult, sit on opposite sides of such a grid, as you can see here. So in this grid, there are various objects, and the child can see all of them. So the child sees what we see here on the screen on the left-hand side. The adult, or also called the director in the game, sits on the other side, and they only see some of the objects because some of the compartments in the grid are blocked off. And the adult, that's the director, gives instructions to the child. For instance, they might say, as in this example here, I can see a big duck. Move the big duck next to the green alien. And for the adult, the big duck is the red duck on the top. For the child, the biggest duck is actually the purple duck. Thus, they need to ignore the distracting purple duck and move the red duck, which is the target duck. So for children, this is not as easy as for us as adults. But bilingual children are better than monolingual children at this task. And as my PhD student had found, children do not need to be able to really speak a second language. She found that weekly lessons of an additional language for about 6 months at school, and that was during a reception year at school, and that was like 1 hour or half an hour a week. So this increased the performance in this task. And this increase was the same as for children who attended bilingual schools, who were really immersed in 2 languages or in a new language. Another advantage is in creative thinking. So this here, this example is also taken from the same study that I just explained on perspective taking. In this task, participants are given a sheet of paper with lots of identical symbols. In this case, it's 2 parallel lines, but there's also sheets with circles or squares. And participants are asked to turn these lines into other objects, into as many different objects as possible. And as you can see here, this child turned the lines into a butterfly, various types of vehicles, various types of animals. There's a desk and something like a pen and some other things that I can't recognize, but the child actually explained what that was supposed to be. Anyway, so what Valeria had found in her study was that bilingual children, or children immersed into a bilingual school, come up with more unique solutions and solutions from more different categories than monolingual children. For this, the children actually needed a substantial language input. So these weekly 1-hour lessons that I talked about, they showed little improvement. There was a little bit, but that wasn't really different from the children who attended a school without a second language. So it was only the children in the bilingual school who were really immersed into this second language who improved within that half year. So the last advantage that I want to present is cognitive reserve. And here we come to the brain, and that fits very well into the Brain Awareness Week. In order to explain the effect of cognitive reserve, I need to first explain what speaking another language actually does to the brain. So, as illustrated here in this figure, the brain is made of two kinds of matter, gray matter and white matter. And both are made of lots and lots of nerve cells. But the white matter are, so to say, the motorways in the brains. That's where the activation, the information travels from one part of the brain to another part of the brain. And what we see in bilinguals is that both types of matter are affected. So bilingualism shows an increase or leads to increase in gray matter in particular areas of the brain, not in all areas, but particularly in areas that are related to language and areas that are related to general cognitive control. And that shows in terms of kind of density in this area, so how packed the nerve cells are in this area, or the size. So sometimes these areas are a little bit bigger in bilinguals. And for the people who know more about the functions of different brain areas, I should also mention that bilinguals seem to use more areas deeper or deep inside the brain and more towards the back of the brain than the frontal areas for cognitive control tasks. In addition, it has been found that older bilingual speakers also have higher white matter integrity. Thus, the white matter connections function better. So their highways, the motorways function better in bilinguals than in monolingual speakers. So these changes to the brain are believed to benefit when our brains do not function as well anymore, when we get older. So for instance, it has been found that bilingualism delays dementia by about 5 years. And the brain seems to function better during dementia in bilingual speakers. It also functions better after a stroke. Thus, in these cases, it seems particularly beneficial to be an active speaker of another language. But where do these changes to the brain come from? Well, it is well established that the two languages in bilingual speakers are both constantly active, even if one language isn't used at all. It changes a little bit if languages are more often used, then they're more active, but in general, the second language is never really inactive. And that means that bilingual speakers have to constantly manage and monitor their languages. And this exercises the kind of language control system in the brain. And that improves not just the language control system itself, but also general control functions in the brain. Thus, when we ask where do the advantages come from, then one answer is that they come from changes to the brain caused by the need to manage the two languages. This can particularly explain benefits to cognitive functioning, so such as flexible thinking or memory. And it can explain the benefits for the brain in older speakers, like in dementia or stroke, even though stroke can also happen to younger people, but more likely to older people. In addition, bilinguals need to monitor the perspective of communication partners. They need to adapt to their language needs, and that can explain the advantages in perspective taking that I've shown you. And last but not least, being bilingual also means being immersed into two cultures with different belief systems, values, and rules. And that can explain advantages in creative thinking, as bilinguals are used to view situations from different angles. In other words, the different advantages might have different reasons, but all are due to a bilingual experience. Is any type of the bilingual bilingualism beneficial, or any type of bilingualism if beneficial? Are there individual differences? So this is a topic that is currently in the center of research. So we do know already that the brain changes are dependent on the exact experience of individuals. So there's factors such as the duration of the second language use, how often a language is used on a daily basis, whether speakers switch between the languages a lot, or whether they even mix languages, which some people do. So these factors all have different effects and are thought to change the brain more or less, or in different ways. We also know that minimal learning of a second language can have benefits in some, but not all areas. So for instance, we've seen that the 6 months of weekly foreign language sessions have an effect on perspective taking skills, but not on creative thinking. So this is an area that needs much more research, and hopefully we will know more about that very soon. So let's return to the question of the talk. Does bilingualism make you smarter? Well, there are no signs that bilinguals have an advantage in general IQ, or something like emotional intelligence. That's the skill to perceive, regulate, or manage emotions. There are some linguistic disadvantages, but there's also advantages, as we've seen. There are also cognitive control advantages, like in switching between rules, but these advantages are actually rather small. And importantly, there are many further advantages, particularly in children and also in elderly, for instance, in terms of social skills and creative thinking, as I've shown you. Thus, being bilingual is well worth the few disadvantages. But how do we do in the UK with speaking more than one language? Well, Andy was already saying that he doesn't speak much more than English. I assume that's what you implied. Well, only 1 in 3 adults in the UK speak more than one language fluently. So that's less than the world average, so to say. I mean, there's a reason for that, but this is partly also due to pupils not learning a foreign language at school in England or in the UK. So only about 50% of pupils in state-funded schools take a language GCSE, and only 35% achieve a language GCSE of C or higher. And when we look at A levels, it's maybe even sadder, because sadly the number of pupils taking A levels, language A levels, has been falling in the last 10-15 years, with only about 4% learning a language beyond basic level at the moment. So given the advantages that I have shown you, advantages to individual people, but also advantages to society and the economy, this is rather disappointing. So my message for this talk is go and learn languages. And this is not just beneficial for young children, as it's often researched, but also for adults. Well, thank you very much.